Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes, and today we will be diving into an insightful discussion on the updates in the ongoing Israel-Gaza ceasefire and hostage exchange. The ongoing Gaza ceasefire was halted today. This came as Israel accused Hamas of backtracking on the release of hostage Arbel Yehud. The female civilian was expected to be released ahead of the second phase of exchange that took place on Saturday. Israel added that Hamas failed to provide details on the condition of hostages set to be freed in the coming weeks. However, when Hamas did not keep its end of the bargain, Israel denied opening the corridors and allowed Palestinians to return to northern Gaza. Subsequently, in a Qatar-mediated agreement, Hamas said to carry out an additional phase of releasing hostages this Thursday. Qatar's statement said Hamas would hand over the civilian hostage Yehud along with 2 other hostages. 3 more hostages will be released on Saturday. This means that Israel opened the routes through to the Netzarim corridor, allowing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to return home. Government estimates suggest people in Gaza City and the north need 135,000 tents and caravans as they return to destroyed homes. Joining us for the discussion today, we have Lev Aaron, a former coordinator of Israel-India Parliamentary Friendship League, joining us from Israel. We also have Adrian Calamel, a Middle East expert, who's joining us from New York. We have Ross Feingold, a political risk analyst, joining us from Taipei. And finally, Professor Rohan Gunaratne, a Middle East affairs expert. Rohan, I would like to come to you first, and I'd firstly like to look at the movement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are returning to northern Gaza for the first time in months. What is the significance of this number of people moving?
What is important for all of us to understand is they are returning to an area that is not habitable. That is, their infrastructure has been completely destroyed. So that is why they need infrastructure, they need makeshift tents, and they need other supplies. Many of them are very surprised at the scale of destruction of the homes and the areas that they lived. So naturally, this will generate very significant anger and rage. Although many of us see this as Israel's overwhelming response to a terrorist massacre, many of the Gazans do not see it that way because they have been significantly agonized and angered, and they have suffered with the human and the material losses. They blame Israel and the Western nations.
Adrian Calamel, before we come on to the hostage exchanges that have been agreed, I want to continue looking at the state of Gaza. Donald Trump has spoken about clearing it out and potentially spoken to neighbouring countries to see if they would be interested potentially in housing Palestinians. Do you think that there's any responsibility upon Israel to help in rebuilding the country, or do you think it should be up to the Arab nations that are around?
Thank you for having me, Joshua. Personally, I think it should be up to the neighboring nations that are around them. I think it should be up to, we all know that the UN is going to pump money into Gaza to help rebuild the city in the areas that have been taken out and demolished. But this is the cost of unleashing a terrorist attack and then expect that nothing, and then taking hostages back and then moving them around an area, and then using Hamas using them as human shields, and then constantly putting yourself in civilian areas. This was always going to be the outcome, the way Hamas plays this game. If they took hostages back, Gaza was going to be flattened. It was going to be leveled. Now, moving people out of there to other countries, I don't know if that's the best idea, but what I can say is that if this area gets rebuilt, and let's be honest, Qatar could put the money in there. Qatar is the one that funds Hamas. The Islamic Republic is the one that funds Hamas. Hamas was responsible for October 7th, and I see the destruction afterwards. So the Palestinians should hold them accountable, and then the money should come in to rebuild them from Qatar. Qatar should pay the costs of the war. This does not happen October 7th with the Islamic Republic and via Qatar saying, green light it, you're gone.
Yes, and Ross Feingold, looking at this return for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, do you think there is somewhat of a bittersweet feeling and happiness, but also a fear over what they might go back to, and knowing that potentially their life as they knew it isn't going to be as it was before the start of this conflict?
Certainly, from watching the news reports from central or southern Gaza, people are very eager to return back to northern Gaza if that's where they lived before Hamas began this war. But at the same time, they do know that their homes and the infrastructure has been destroyed. They're going to be living in the same conditions in northern Gaza as they've been living in central or southern Gaza, which is basically living in tents and relying on handouts from international organizations. But again, this is what Hamas wanted. Hamas began this war knowing that there would be a significant response from Israel. And unfortunately, the Palestinian people are the ones who are going to pay the price. And how long it will take to rebuild, we have no way of knowing. Certainly, that depends a lot on how much financial assistance comes from other Arab countries or Europe, for example. But it's not going to be quick. And people returning to northern Gaza are going to be living in dire conditions, just similar to the conditions they've been living in central and southern Gaza. But the fault here does definitely lie with Hamas.
Lev Aran, I would like to come now to the newly arranged hostage release dates that we have. We know, of course, on Thursday, 3 hostages are going to be released, and one of those is Arbel Yehud. I really want to understand, and so our audience understand, the significance of her release.
What happened is that she was supposed to release, but then the Islamic Jihad invented that she's part of the Israeli space program, which everybody knew it is like a lie. But once you release a military person, you get 50 prisoners back. You get 50 prisoners back to Gaza and West Bank, and not only 30. And it was a sticky wicket, because what Israel did is, once they saw that Arbel Yehud is not one of the hostages who is coming back to Israel, they closed the Netzarim corridor. And then the Gazans were very angry at the Islamic Jihad and at Hamas. And then they have to give up. And now we have additional wave of hostages who will be back to Israel, thanks to this mini game. So they tried to play a game, but of course they failed at the end of the game.
Professor Gunaratne, does this sort of breaking down in the hostage deal show that there still is a tentative nature to it? Of course, we've heard Israeli officials call it a temporary ceasefire, but this hold-up has potential to unravel the whole deal. Do you think it's still hanging on a knife edge, or do you think there's more certainty now that these issues have been resolved?
It is a very temporary, a very tentative ceasefire. It is because there is no genuine commitment on the part of Hamas to release the hostages. Hamas knows that once all the hostages are released, that Israeli military forces, intelligence community will redeploy in Gaza and eliminate Hamas. Israel firmly believes that the state of Israel will be under constant and continuous threat if Hamas is still existing in Gaza. And that is why Hamas is playing all these games by keeping hostages, by delaying the process. At this point, Hamas released the 33 hostages, or agreed to do so, because they were terrified with the threat from President-elect Trump, now President of the United States, that he will give them hell if they are not going to release the hostages. So I want to share with you that terrorist groups should be threatened, because unless they are under constant threat, they will not cooperate and collaborate. And today, unfortunately, the people who have suffered as a result of Hamas extremism and terrorism is the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. So I believe that the international community, especially the Arab and the Muslim countries, should work with the US and should work with Israel to restore and rebuild Gaza, but to have a permanent ceasefire. The conditions for this should be that Hamas should surrender.
Adrian Calamel, I want to pick up on Professor Gunaratne's point there. Do you think that Israel and Israel's military will re-engage once the hostages are released? And how do you think that might play out? Will it be similar to what we saw before this ceasefire deal, or do you think there will be a different strategy in the way that they try to take out Hamas?
That's a great question. I do think that Israel will have to engage again. I mean, we hear from our side, we hear the message to the Western Street that Israel has had to had problems with the is probably going to re-engage. But you hear Hamas and you hear their leadership, and they vow to do this over and over and over again. October 7th. So ceasefire is really not, it's a temporary ceasefire, whatever you may want to call it. Problem with groups like Hamas are they are never going to stop. They have this maximalist approach that is the destruction of Israel. So Israel will have to, at some point when Hamas starts to violate, and it's probably when it starts to come to stage 2, if we even get to phase 2, because as Rohan was saying, is that the hostages were always leverage, and that was the most leverage that Hamas had over the Israelis. As soon as they lose that, they lose all leverage over Israel. So as far as operations go, we have to remember that a lot of the Hamas leadership has been taken out. A lot of the commanders have been taken out. So it's going to be, again, a matter of thinning out the squads. Probably a lot of these individuals that have been released from prison who are not just prisoners. They're actually individuals who have been detained on terrorism charges. So, yeah, I don't see this holding up. I hope it holds up long enough to get all the hostages back and recover the bodies, because we know a lot of the bodies, a lot of people there are no longer alive, unfortunately.
Ross Feingold, if we get into a position where the hostages are released and the IDF re-engage, what's stopping us getting back to a position where we were before the ceasefire deal was agreed, but this time Hamas just don't have any leverage? Is there a potential that the jubilation and the scenes that we're seeing from the Palestinians is going to be short-lived, and that people living in Gaza might be thrown back into the same conditions that they were just weeks ago?
It's certainly very possible, and in that scenario, not only would Prime Minister Netanyahu have the support of many Israelis, again, assuming that hostages or the remains of deceased hostages were already returned to Israel, but in that scenario, Prime Minister Netanyahu would also have the firm support of President Donald Trump. President Trump is clearly a partial to Israel. He has an excellent relationship with Netanyahu, and President Trump, he's not going to have any sympathy towards Hamas continuing to attack Israel. So if we actually get to that scenario where Hamas is still a threat to Israel, but the hostages or the remains of deceased hostages have already been returned to Israel, and the leadership of Israel decides to re-engage in hostilities, in that scenario, I think we're going to see a very supportive United States government, even more supportive than the Biden administration was.
Leveran, I want to pick up on what Ross Feingold said there. We know that there has been criticism towards Benjamin Netanyahu from within Israel based on his decision to stop the military action and agree this deal. Do you think that Netanyahu's popularity will rise after re-engagement if it happens? And how do you think that will help him navigate his parliament as well as the war effort?
All pollsters show that if there are elections tomorrow, Netanyahu is losing the elections. And the current deal is not really helping him. And we are still in the easy part, because in the first fortnight, it is still a humanitarian negotiations. So we see prisoners, we see hostages. But the next stage, and this is the reason why the Palestinians gave up with Arbel Yehud. The second stage is negotiation about a permanent ceasefire. and what Hamas wants. Hamas know that they cannot be a de jure people in Gaza. They cannot control Gaza de jure, but they still want to be the de facto rulers of Gaza. And if this happens, if we are into negotiations in which there will be a permanent ceasefire and Hamas will be the de facto rulers of Gaza, I think I can't see how it is good news for Benjamin Netanyahu as a politician.
Professor Gunnar Ratner, I'd like to get your opinion on this topic, looking specifically at the people living within Gaza, the people that aren't associated to Hamas. It doesn't look positive, whichever way you look at it, if Israel do re-engage these people. Humanitarian crises, of course, continued throughout many months, but is there a real fear, do you think, that conditions will get back to where they were and maybe even worse, with so many people currently living in temporary accommodation and so many more tents and caravans, as we've mentioned, already needed?
It is a question of time that the IDF and the Israeli intelligence community will resume operations in Gaza, because Hamas is very rapidly constituting. It is true, their high level, the apex leadership, mid-level leadership has suffered, but Hamas has very quickly revived, and Israel's security calculus is to protect itself, it must launch operations. And many of the hostages have been killed, and at some point Israel will go back, and then of course the civilians will once again suffer. So if the neighboring countries, if the international community really cares about the population in Gaza, they must offer some assistance. Maybe they should accept a very large number of Gazans to their countries, at least until Gaza has been cleared of Hamas. With Hamas, Israel will not be secure, and everyone knows that, even the Palestinians know that. And of course, the Palestinians themselves will not be safe as long as Hamas continues to exist in Gaza.
Ross Feingold, do you think that Iran can do anything? We know, of course, that they have backed several of the proxy groups around Israel, but do you think Iran could play a part in ending potential devastation for millions of people still within Gaza?
Well, the issue with Iran is, frankly, don't get involved. They decided to get involved by funding Hamas and providing weapons to Hamas. They decided to get involved by providing weapons and funding to Hezbollah. They decided to get involved by providing weapons and funding to the Houthis in Yemen. This was a terrible strategic mistake by Iran. It was not in their best interest to do so, and frankly, they've been humiliated because they decided to get involved in something that had nothing to do with their country. And if they decide to get involved again, I think the results are going to be the same. It's not really to Iran's benefit. It doesn't benefit the people of Iran for the leadership, the religious extremist leadership of Iran, to be getting involved in other parts of the Middle East. So it really behooves them to behave and fix their own country and stop getting involved and stop being such a threat to Israel, because there's no good benefit that will arise from that.
Adrian Calamel, on the flip side to that, with Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump potentially united in their aims and their ambitions, and of course the support as well, we know that the US have not frozen aid to Israel. Do you think that potentially something can turn on Iran, and do you think we might see action against Iran from a united US and Israel?
Great question, Joshua. And this is actually my hope. When I first heard that this ceasefire deal and the hostage exchange, and then was pressured on Netanyahu to sign this agreement or to get involved with this, my original thinking was that this is an attempt to get people back, number one, but also to say, let's stop playing around the margins. Let's look at the true source of chaos, death, destruction in the region, and that starts with Ali Khamenei in the Islamic Republic. And we know that Trump to give him credit where credit's due, his maximum pressure campaign was the first policy towards the Islamic Republic that was actually effective, where it drained them down, their foreign currency reserves down to $4 billion. It really had them teetering. So my hope is that he doesn't wait 2 years as he did till 2018 to institute the maximum pressure, that he's going to play a little good cop right now, but eventually go to bad cop and say, we're going to put the restrictions on you, we're going to enforce those sanctions, and also we're going to take some kinetic actions as well. That would be my hope, and then let the Iranian people, which is, you have about 85 million Iranian people that despise this regime, and help them and let them take back their country. So everybody understands that the Islamic Republic is the center of chaos and creates violence in vacuums so that it can fill those vacuums in the region.
Staying with you very briefly, Adrian, we've spoken, of course, here on NewsX about the war between Russia and Ukraine and the impact that's potentially being created with two dividing factions. But Adrian, I want to look at Iran's relationship with Russia and, of course, the US's relationship with Israel. How do you think that could play out on a more geopolitical and worldwide scale?
Well, I think that's important. I think that's important that the United States starts to recognize that, Tehran is interlinked with Moscow, which is interlinked with Beijing. And that actually some of the actions that Netanyahu took during that last strike, such as taking out drone factories, ballistic missiles that were being shipped to Russia to be used against the Ukrainians, these have been helpful. So you can't, as I said before, they can't be dealt with in compartmentalized issues, and understand that there are three main adversaries towards the Western world order out there, and they sit in Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing. So yeah, it's not a matter of weakness invites all sorts of problems, and we've seen weakness all over the last 4 years. What Trump is inheriting is a foreign policy of absolute weakness and appeasement. So the U.S. needs to get back on some forward footing and support its allies and near-peer allies in the region.
Lev, Iran, bringing it back to the Middle East as we close this debate up, I really want to find out the feeling from within Israel currently. Of course, hostages are being released at a slower rate, but they are coming through consistently. I just want to get an understanding and get our audience an understanding of the feeling now that these hostages are being returned, and they're being returned alive and seemingly healthy.
Look, for Netanyahu and also for the military establishment, October 7th was a one-trick pony of Hamas. But for the Admi Israelis, for the simple ones, for normal Israelis, it was a huge trauma. And the hugest trauma was the fact that they could, they could take into Gaza more than 200 Israelis. So we were all in tears last Saturday and the Saturday before. So now there is a huge wave of sympathy for those who were in Gaza. We don't know what they went through, all these girls. And on the other hand, there is the big question, what will be next? Because for Netanyahu, it is crystal clear that Hamas cannot do the same trick again. But for most Israelis, they want something more reliable between Israel and Gaza. And if Hamas, even a weakened Hamas, is a de facto ruler of Gaza, it will be a huge embarrassment for Netanyahu, and Netanyahu knows it.
Ross Feingold, just to finish here, of course Hamas's willingness to lay down their arms and to surrender, we know realistically that's not really a possibility. Do you think that there's another potential solution that could see Gaza and Palestinians ruled by a government like we've seen potentially in Lebanon?
It's possible, but Hamas would still have to go away. So if they're not willing to surrender, there would have to be some kind of negotiated evacuation, somewhat similar to the PLO's evacuation from Lebanon 40 years ago. But as of the moment, Hamas doesn't seem inclined to do that. They want to fight to the death. And if they want to fight to the death, they're going to continue to bring death and destruction to their own people. And they don't seem to really care.
Thank you, Ross Feingold. Thank you, Lev Aran. Also, thank you to our other guests, Adrian Calamel and Professor Gunnar Rapner. As the ceasefire deal continues to hold, developments as they come through, we will, of course, bring them to you from Israel, the Middle East, and also across the world.